Hello and welcome to our final week together in Introduction to Psychology, and exciting for a number of reasons. Ending the class, the weather's really nice today, and the semester's coming to an end, and hopefully all those final papers are coming in, and I'll be grading those as quickly as possible to get your final results to you. So let's quickly get into our last chapter here, which is the area of psychology that psychology is probably most famous for, as I've said in the last chapter, and that is dealing with abnormal behavior. So we took a time last week to talk about what is abnormal, touched a little bit on treatment and rehabilitation. We'll go a little bit into that today, and then talk about the barriers that exist for individuals with mental illness and other mental disorders from seeking assistance. So we're going to be taking on today chapter 16, therapy and treatment. What do we do about individuals who are experiencing mental health problems? Now, in somewhat of a review, this is from last week, we have, in terms of mental illness, we have this pervasive, persistent presence of symptomology that interferes with many aspects of life. And so we have a biological approach, which kind of I'm going to call treatment for right now. And then we have the psychosocial approach, which has to do with rehabilitation. So quite very quickly, this is from last week, we have the biological approach focuses on reducing the symptomology of the particular mental illness, primarily using medications, but also therapy and other forms of treatment. And success is defined as less symptoms, and therefore, less symptoms means the individual doesn't experience as many barriers because they're not as sick as they were before. If you use the term, the illness word of sick. And so by reducing the symptoms, the individual is able to engage in more normal behaviors. Now, on the psychosocial end, we often make the assumption that it's in the here and now. So while the medications and therapy are pursuing a reduction in symptoms, we have to do something. And then there's, of course, with mental illness, this is persistent, so that some of the symptoms and some of the overall effects of having had a mental illness persist over time. So further intervention, we call rehabilitation, or even habilitation, which I'll get into momentarily, is important to support that person in the community. It's a focus on living with the symptoms, however many are left after the focus on reducing symptoms. It focuses on rehabilitation, returning a person to their former level of functioning, or teaching them new skills that they may never have had the encounter to learn. Independent living in the environment, not in an institution, the least restrictive of all the different ways in which that person can live. And of course, focusing on barriers that exist between them and these goals. Happiness, achieving goals, and less disruption in their life is actually what we would call successful rehabilitation. So let's spend a little bit of time actually talking about medication. Now, this image comes from my, very early in the class, we talked about neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals that exist within our nervous system that provide a transportation of information across the synaptic gap so that one neuron can communicate with another. When we refer to medications, medications for the treatment of mental illness, we kind of put them together as psychotropics. So they're the psyche, meaning the mind, and tropic is almost, when you think about the layout or the interventions into the layout of the chemistry within the brain. All chemicals, almost everything that we ingest has a psychotropic effect. I mean, aspirin has an effect on the nervous system. Eating carrots has an effect on the nervous system. Very small effects. And psychotropic medications are specifically designed to target particular areas of the brain to target particular neurotransmitters to either increase the presence of those neurotransmitters, increase the effectiveness of those neurotransmitters, or decrease those neurotransmitters, or decrease the effectiveness of those neurotransmitters, and thus get an overall effect of either increasing particular aspects of a human's behavior or decreasing other aspects of their behavior. And so this is a chemical approach, and most of that action is happening within the synapse. There are different medications that have different effects on different components of this action that's happening right here at the synapse that we talked about way earlier. There are some medications that look a lot like and act a lot like existing neurotransmitters. So we put them in there, and there's just more presence of that neurotransmitter. There are other chemicals and psychotropic medications that will destroy neurotransmitters, or they will clog up the receptors on the distal neuron in order to slow down the transmission of that particular message. And these are the different ways in which medicines affect our nervous system. And it's somewhat of an art, somewhat of a, I mean, anybody who's worked in this field understands that there's no magic pill. And oftentimes individuals' brain chemistry will change over time. So the medication that worked at one time doesn't necessarily work later. It's a very frustrating, sometimes very confusing way in which this approach works. Notwithstanding the presence of what we would call side effects or unintended effects. When we ingest medications, we're intending them to operate in the brain, but that doesn't keep them from operating all over the body. So maybe we wanted to slow down some of the rapid thinking and processing of a person with schizophrenia, but at the same time, we're also slowing down their muscular nervous system. So there's these other effects, side effects that happen, unintended effects. And there's always this discussion of what is the balance between the therapeutic effect and what we call the iatrogenic effect, or the negative aspects of treatment. And we have to weigh those with an individual. Does the cost benefit balance of taking particular medications or trying other forms of treatment? Now, medications are not the only way in which the medical community addresses mental illness. There are also new horizons here on deep brain stimulation, particularly for two areas, depression and Parkinson's disease, which is actually a very exciting area, looking at deep brain stimulation and attending to some of those particular diseases. We have vagus nerve stimulation, again, similar to the deep brain stimulation, and a somewhat controversial one for depression, electroconvulsive therapy, kind of a blunt instrument, but yet some people have experienced some recovery from deep and untractable, basically depression that will not leave. It just, they've taken the medications, they've done all those things, and they just cannot break out of that, and as a last ditch effort, going into electroconvulsive therapy. Now, notwithstanding, there's also a movement to be using natural remedies and even what used to be recreational drugs, like the use of marijuana, and sometimes and coming up in terms of popularity in the research is the use of substances like LSD to treat PTSD. And these are kind of on the edge of science, or looking at those things. These are, of course, somewhat dangerous and, of course, for the time being, and in many instances illegal, but examining those substances for their therapeutic effect, not their recreational effect, but the therapeutic effect. And that's providing an avenue of change that could certainly enhance the life of many people. Now, this particular perspective, this is the problem is in the individual. There's a biochemical problem, there's something wrong with their brain chemistry, there's something wrong with their brain structure, there's something wrong with the individual. So it's an important contrast in understanding the two areas of addressing mental illness that I'm going to include in this lecture, to understand that these particular perspectives, they view mental illness as the illness being located in the person. We need to fix the person. So the focus is there. And this is a valid perspective. I'm not saying this is invalid. There is a problem going on. And I mean that problem, not that someone's problematic. To be able to respond to that as we respond with anybody who has an illness. Somebody has cancer, we respond with that. And so addressing the problem within the individual is part of our treatment. It's a major focus of treatment. But it's not the only thing going on. So we have another perspective of approaching dealing with individuals with mental health problems, and that is psychosocial rehabilitation. I want to talk about that word rehabilitation. Habilitation is the teaching of skills that we need to interact and live in our world. Everything from activities of daily living like self-care and bathing to how to hold a job. All of these things. And rehabilitation implies that we are providing an individual with an environment to be able to return that individual to their previous level of functioning prior to the onset of their mental illness. Now, the curious thing about this is, in fact, at the many mental illnesses have an age of onset in the teenage years. So their normative developmental processes have brought them to their teenage years, and then there's this extreme intervention from the environment, which is the mental illness. The mental illness manifests in that individual and disrupts the natural process of learning and adapting to enter from adolescence into the adult world. Some of the skills that we focus on when we are doing rehabilitation really have a ring to it of habilitation. These are skills that the person may have never developed because, based on the age of onset of the mental illness, they were not able to access and participate in the regular social dynamics that would teach those kinds of skills to those individuals. They may have been hospitalized, they may have been ostracized, they may have been isolated. So the lessons that we learn with our friends, the lessons that we learn in those first jobs, the lessons that we learn when we graduate and either go to college or go to work, go to the military, the relationships that we have in that early adulthood, a person might have missed all that, and therefore there's this kind of gap, this chasm of skills that the individual may not have because they never learned them in the first place. So psychosocial rehabilitation is both an effort to teach skills that an individual used to be able to do, and they have to find a new way to do them because of the presence of their symptoms, or, and has been in the case in most of the work that I've done, to help them to learn skills that they missed out on along the way while the focus of their lives were on their mental illness and its immediate and pervasive impacts on their lives. So when we when we are doing the psychosocial rehabilitation thing, it's important to recognize that we meet our client where they're at. This is very different than the traditional medical model. If you think about the medical model as it stands right now, I go to my doctor and my doctor tells me what to do in order to bring me from a state of illness to a better state of wellness. So he's basically casting the line, kind of bringing me in a little closer, kind of thing. And that's perfectly appropriate. That's why I go see my doctor. The rehabilitation approach is I'm going to meet with my client and understand on a philosophical and practical level as to what their skill level is right now. And my expectations are going to be what they already know how to do, which might be, in some cases, very high, and in other cases, very low. I may meet a person who has missed out on a whole lot of socialization, and they may have very low skill levels, and I have to understand that my initial work with that individual needs to be where they're at. I can't stand back and say, okay, come to me. There's no framework, there's no template upon which they can, if it's rehabilitation, pure rehabilitation, the person's done it before, we can remind them of what they did before, encourage them to do those skills again, but sometimes they've just simply never done it. So that deep, deep philosophy of meeting the client where they're at, it even manifests in the fact that I go to my doctor's office to receive medical treatment. As a case manager, I went to my client's house to provide my treatment. So just that alone, that we go to where the person is at, is a stark difference between these two very important aspects of how we deal with persons with mental illness, how we help them. Now, the framework of psychosocial rehabilitation is based upon some principles and values that we carry as case managers and other types of workers within the mental health system. We provide a sense of hope that indeed, despite the fact that you've been diagnosed with a chronic, pervasive, persistent illness, there is hope, there is evidence of individuals being able to live productive and satisfying lives. We treat our clients with respect. They are human beings, regardless of their behavior, regardless of what they've done in the past. This is really an embodiment of the principle of unconditional positive regard put forth by Carl Rogers. And it's really a part of modern approaches to any individual who's having issues, even within the jail system or within the mental health system. We treat individuals with dignity, not putting them down, not treating them like children, even though developmentally there might be some areas of their life where their skill level is that of children. We are very active, and this is not a passive process. The practitioner is active because oftentimes the motivation is kind of the, let's say, the material, the clay that we're dealing with. We're trying to help an individual to realize the benefits of their extra effort in order to change their lives in a scenario that has often put them down. And so we are active and enthusiastic in how we work with that individual to bring that energy into the situation and help charge up the process of rehabilitation. Other aspects include a very informal approach, partnership between the rehabilitation worker and the client. We focus on teaching skills that individual has and can develop in order to adapt to a life with mental illness. It's very individualized. There's very few times that we have, standard protocols. And we kind of think of that, how different that is than the medical world. Somebody comes in with a cold, there's a protocol. We're going to do this, this, that, send you home. An individual comes in with a mental illness, and there are protocols on the medical side. We're going to give you this medication first. We're not going to jump to this medication without trying this medication first. Those kinds of protocols. But when it comes to rehabilitation, it's like I could have two clients on the same day with the same goal, and we're approaching it totally different in terms of how that individual is going to return to that level of functioning. We empower individuals to advocate for themselves, to take risks, to develop a different sense of their own identity, to develop a sense of self-esteem, and really empower them to feel worthy of the kind of work that they're engaged in. We're primarily preventive. Essentially, when we're looking at mental illness, the most disruptive of aspects of mental illness is hospitalization. Repeated, cyclical, long-term hospitalization the individual is taken out of their natural environment, placed in a hospital, structured environment, which has positive and iatrogenic effects on that individual. And it disrupts their jobs, their relationships, their home life. It's just hugely disruptive. If you and I go into the hospital, and assuming for the moment I'm talking to those who have never had to deal with psychiatric admissions, we go to the hospital, it's just a couple days, and we feel disrupted. We feel we were out of the loop. You know, who's going to take care of my plants? Who's going to feed the dog? I mean, just a couple days is going to throw us off, let alone some of you have experienced extended stays. Imagine an individual being in the hospital for over a year, or over the course of the year having repeated hospitalizations. Incredibly disruptive. So part of what we do is working with the symptom reduction and skill set, we help the individual to develop strategies to avoid hospitalization, while at the same time we plan for hospitalization. So if I have an individual who I'm working with who has a very distinct cycle of pattern in their mental illness in terms of exacerbations of their symptoms or whatever, and we recognize that over time, we can plan accordingly. We can say, you know, if the individual goes into the hospital, we can work out a plan with the landlord to hold the apartment for longer than they might normally hold that person, develop a mechanism for being able to pay that rent or partially pay that rent, to hold that apartment for a while, so the individual, when they are discharged from the hospital, they're not as totally disrupted as they might have been. So both of those avenues being a part of that rehabilitation process. We deal with a diversity of individuals and a diversity of symptomology and whatnot. We see again, it's kind of tied to the individuality of the individual. And it's real world, and I probably put this one sort of last because probably one of the most important things. It's the rehabilitation exists within the real world, and we recognize that an individual with a chronic, pervasive, persistent mental illness will experience barriers to their functioning that are less to do with their symptomology and expressions and whatnot, and they're to do with the actual environment in which that they live, the real world. So, for example, an individual has a mental illness and they're living in an apartment building. This is very fictitious here. They're living in an apartment building, and their neighbors don't know that they have a mental illness. So, figuratively speaking, they see each other, they say hi, develop, you know, what level of relationship they're going to have, and the individual's in their house and they're trying to cook something, and they realize they're out of sugar, and they go to their neighbor and ask to borrow a couple of teaspoons of sugar. No problem. Until the neighbors find out he has a mental illness. The individual has not changed. The individual has not done anything different. What has changed is the perception of the neighbors. So what used to be an individual who was just our neighbor now becomes our neighbor with a mental illness, and they knock on the door, and all the stigma and associations and fears and unknowns and what come into play, this has nothing to do with the client. Now, this is a very, light version of that. We have individuals that once it's revealed that they have a mental illness, they can be let go from work. As illegal as that is, that still happens. They cannot be hired. People with a mental illness often struggle with answering that question. Let's say there's on the application for a job, they have to write out, is there any medical condition that you have that might prohibit your functioning in this work? And you say, well, yeah, I have a mental illness, but if I write that down, what's the likelihood I'm going to get hired? And if I don't write that down and they find out, what's the likelihood I'm going to get fired for falsifying my application? What a really, really hard place for an individual to be in. So a lot of the times we engage with the client, but we're actually changing the environment. We speak to the employers. We speak to the neighbors. We speak to the landlords. We speak to all of these different, the different individuals that will interact with our client. When we develop a network of understanding around that individual, essentially a community to support that individual as they pursue living in the community. The problem is in the environment. You look at these, we're giving hope to the individual, we're raising that individual up, we're giving them the skills, but primarily from a rehab point of view, from an independent living point of view, you can look that up to see what the history of all that. The problem is not the individual, the focus is the environment, creating an environment for that person to be able to be successful. Now, despite all that, there are tremendous barriers to seeking help. We can see with these statistics, 1 out of 4 of American adults are living with a diagnosable mental illness. It's widespread. It's almost not even the rare category, in terms of, that definition of abnormal. 75% of adult onset mental illness are present by age 25. So it happens early in life, yet 40% of the individuals who may benefit from mental health services do not seek treatment. It is not the disease that people want people to know about. If I'm in a classroom and I say to my students, how many individuals here have a personal experience with cancer? There's hardly anybody who has had that experience who would not raise their hand. They get a lot of social support. They got, you're a survivor, you're in all this stuff. And I would be hard pressed to get any responses at all, let alone even ask the question from my students, how many people in this room have had a psychiatric admission? The stigma is so strong about seeking that kind of help that an individual keeps it to themselves. In fact, more often than not, will actually not seek out that treatment. It's too embarrassing, too scary, too unknown, and all of those societal barriers create barriers for individuals seeking assistance with their mental health problems. That ends our chapter, and let's look at some of our assessments here. I want you to engage in a discussion about these barriers and what you understand about them, what you've read about them, possibly even what you personally have experienced, either directly or indirectly, barriers that individuals with mental health issues experience. There's a quiz where I'm asking you questions about the difference between treatment and rehabilitation, and there's a medical model, biology versus rehabilitation. So just kind of keep all that discussion out there. And then finally, you did a little bit of prep before, and now is the assignment, creating a infographic on a mental illness, mental disorder of your choice, using Canva, a particular tool to create basically a graphic representation of statistics and treatments and where it comes from, etiology, that's the name of etiology, where something comes from, and creating a graphic representation like something you would hang on the wall that informs individuals about this particular mental illness. And we draw to a close this class, this last subject matter. I intend on doing one more video to kind of close off the class next week when all the grading is done and do all that, but I certainly want to end this with a congratulations on making it this far, and I look forward to your final work here, look forward to reading your final papers and getting this semester all wrapped up with you. So I will be in lots of communication over the next week about various aspects of the class, and I wish you luck. And stay strong on this one. Finish strong and get the best grades that you can, and I will see you later.